Hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Nick Cohen. I'm a columnist on The Observer. I work for lots of other papers. Very much, I think, like everyone involved in over the next coming days, I very much want to thank Justice for Journalists and the Foreign Policy Centre and everyone who's been involved in raising this hugely important but actually really quite difficult issue to explain to people who are not involved in the battles over press freedom. It's difficult, it strikes me, for two reasons. One, we seem to have two separate worlds. The first is the autocratic world, whose geography is expanding all the time. As Helena made clear, countries like the Philippines that we used to think were moving towards democracy are now moving in the other direction. And they're the problem for journalists, for NGOs, for citizens who are trying to investigate power, trying to, you use grand phrases like holding power to account, trying to just explain the suffering they see around them. There, the problem is the oppressive state capture, the state or state militias or state-backed agents using everything to stop them up to including murder. And on the other hand, we seem to have our world, or certainly my world here in London, a safe city, the capital of a democracy, and that seems to be further apart. But there is a connection between the two. And I won't make any apology, because I know there are journalists from all over the world watching this, for being a bit Anglo-centric during this presentation, because the connection is the power of money, in particular in the UK, increasingly Ireland, and to a lesser extent the US, given by the common law. England, UK, forgive me, is the only country in Europe that it doesn't have a revolution in the 18th century. It's not invaded by Napoleon, which is, on the whole, quite a good thing. No one wants to be invaded. But what that has meant is that the old legal system of England has remained, and it is a system that gives enormous power to money. As Helena Kennedy was saying earlier, you get caught up with libel, with privacy, with increasingly data protection law in the UK, and it can cost you millions. Now, as well as Helena said, there's nothing new in this. The use by rich men of the English legal system to just batter journalism with writs and the threat of losing vast amounts of money in costs, not so much in the punishment but in costs, is nothing new. What has changed are two things. First of all, the global scope. Daphne Caruana Galizia, when she died, was murdered, when she was murdered, she had dozens and dozens of lawsuits outstanding against her, trying to shut her up. And those lawsuits weren't only in the Maltese courts, they were from firms here in London threatening to sue her in the British courts. So on the one hand, Britain is claiming, if not quite universal jurisdiction, is saying anyone with a connection to Britain can sue. Well, ever since Napoleon III fled here in the 19th century, every rich man, every rich corrupt man, every corrupt dictatorship has known they need two things: foreign bank and a home in London. Establishing a connection to Britain is not at all hard if you are a billionaire and have bought your bolt hole in Mayfair, just in case. Sometimes to make money, sometimes you never know what's going to happen, and you might want somewhere to come. The other thing that has changed was said to me by a brilliant investigative journalist, Tom Burgess of the Financial Times, who's just a superb writer and author, has written a book on kleptocracy and is now, needless to add, facing legal action in the High Court in London from Kazakhstani oligarchs. he made a wonderful point to me, which I think everyone needs to bear in mind who doubts why this conference matters. One of the great trends of the 21st century, forgive me, one of its trends has been the rise in power of autocratic and oligarchical wealth. That has got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the decline in power and in the financial resources of those institutions with an ability to investigate them. The police services, particularly here in Britain, the policing of finance and the policing of corruption have seen their budgets cut and cut. And so has journalism. Those organisations, and certainly not all journalistic organisations feel a heavy duty for that, but papers like mine, The Observer, The Guardian, serious papers, serious broadcasters, again, the money has just streamed out of them as the web has destroyed our business models. So one answer to the question I want to put to our panel is why this matters now is, as the media has got weaker, it is less able to afford, even in safe countries such as the UK, it's less able to afford to stand up to this. And equally, as the media has got weaker, again, people here, people in this room, people watching will know other people have stepped in or want to step in. Freelance journalists, investigative journalists, citizens, NGOs. But then they are then faced with the same barrage of attacks as a financially weakened media. And so they need answers as much as the journalists do. Now, we have a terrific panel with you today. But before you go, before I introduce you to them, and they know far more about this than me, and will give far more coherent, I hope, explanations of what's going wrong, and perhaps some answers too, who knows. But before we do, we have a video to show you, I think. A video about SLAPPs. I'm looking into the darkness at the end of a room. I'm hoping there's some director in a Hollywood manner will say lights, cameras, action. And the video that we've done, which
intimidate public watchdogs into self-censorship, and they can have a profound impact on media freedom. But some jurisdictions are fighting back by enacting legislation that can neutralise a SLAPP, including a new phenomenon is putting our free press at risk. Journalists are public watchdogs. By bringing information that is in the public interest to light, they help to hold power to account. But what if powerful or wealthy people wanted to keep their illicit affairs a secret? What would it take to silence a journalist? Abusive legal threats and lawsuits are increasingly being used to intimidate journalists or media outlets into withholding or removing critical coverage, even if it is accurate and in the public interest. Although the lawsuit may have little or no chance of succeeding in court, the journalist is nonetheless forced to spend an inordinate amount of time, money, and energy on defending themselves and their work. If they don't, they lose by default and could be forced to pay thousands or even millions in damages. This form of legal harassment is known as SLAPP, which stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. SLAPPs exploit the law in order to covertly, yet aggressively, intimidate public watchdogs into self-censorship, and they can have a profound impact on media freedom. But some jurisdictions are fighting back by enacting legislation that can neutralise a SLAPP, including by enabling judges to quickly dismiss meritless cases that would otherwise be used to zap the journalists' time, money and energy. We must call on our government and on international bodies to adopt similar legislation that can protect our media freedom, our rule of law and our democracies. Until such legislation is adopted, we must ensure that journalists can continue holding power to account. If you are a journalist facing a SLAPP, Index on Censorship can connect you to a network of financial and legal support. Together we can combat SLAPPs by making them backfire, by exposing intimidatory tactics, and by refusing to be silenced.
Okay, now let's turn to our panel. That video, as you saw, was made by Index on Censorship, and I'm delighted to say we have Jessica Vinanen, Campaigns Manager of Index on Censorship, with us today from on my far left. Next to her we have Flutura Kusari, Legal Advisor, European Centre for Press and Media Freedom. She will talk next. We have Charlie Holt from English Pen, and Legal Advisor for European Centre, forgive me, for Press and Media Freedom. And Nancy, do we have? We are meant to have Lady Nancy Zuluaga Jaramillo from Business and Human Rights joining us on. Oh, we do. Hello, Nancy. Can you hear us? Hi. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with Jessica, with Jess. I'm going to ask everyone here to speak for, well, I'm sure they'll speak for as long as they bloody want. I mean, there's no, I will try to get them to speak for 6 or 7 minutes, and then I will ask questions, and please, everyone here, everyone watching can ask questions too. We've got a microphone here for anyone who wants to speak, and we are connected via the amazing technology we have here online. So anyone wants to email or send questions in, I can pick them up and put them to the panel. Okay, Jess, do you want to start?
What shall I?
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm supposed to be in charge of this already. Already, the whole thing is falling apart.
By the order. I'm really sorry.
Oh, I see. Oh, right.
Yeah.
And who wants to speak after Charlie? So I've got it completely wrong. All right. Well, let's rewind that. Charlie Holt. Charlie Holt. I think everyone wants to hear from you first.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much for that. And it's a huge pleasure to be here today and to speak alongside Flutura, Jessica, and Lady. And it's a big pleasure to be introduced by Nick Cohen, whose articles on legal bullies and libel abuse I was reading back when I was a teenager. And I say that not because I want to draw attention to my relative youth or to gush endlessly at Nick, but because I think it's important to avoid the suggestion that SLAPPs are a new phenomenon that originated in the US and have only recently arrived on the shores of the UK. That's not true. As Nick says, as long as people have been able to sue each other, the rich and powerful have used that process to shut down criticism. When John Profumo stood up in the House of Commons in 1963 and said that he would not hesitate to issue writs of libel and slander against anyone who accused him of having an improper relationship with Christine Keeler, he was engaging in what we now refer to as legal intimidation. And in fact, you can point to almost any high-profile scandal in the 20th or 21st centuries, and you will almost invariably find a pattern of legal intimidation and lawsuits preceding its exposure. SLAPPs are parasitic. They feed off deficiencies in the law. The fewer procedural protections you have in place to guard against this abuse, the more SLAPPs you see emerging. And that's why the story of SLAPPs so often begins in the USA. For a number of reasons: astronomically high legal fees, a litigious culture, an absence of legal aid. The USA has proven to be particularly fertile ground for SLAPPs. As we'll see later on in this conference, later on today, sadly the same is true in the United Kingdom. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that, as Helena Kennedy was saying earlier, the word SLAPP was originally coined by 2 US academics, George Pring and Penelope Kanan. In the 1980s, they set about researching this phenomenon, and they found a discernible growth in the use of SLAPPs, which they attributed to the rise of environmental groups in the 1970s. In short, people were becoming more effective at holding the powerful to account, and the powerful were becoming more aggressive in their retaliatory tactics as a result. More recently, over the last 10 years or so, we've seen this growth accelerate. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. But the two I just mentioned very briefly, and they really go to what Nick was saying earlier. The first is the growth of populism and polarization. It is much easier in a climate of political tribalism to stand up in court and say with a straight face that a journalist is propagating fake news or that an activist is an eco-terrorist. I think another reason is that SLAPP litigants are learning from each other. So you will see SLAPP plaintiffs becoming emboldened by the perceived success of aggressive SLAPP tactics around the world. Helena Kennedy alluded earlier to the case of Stephen Donziger and the lawsuits, the RICO lawsuits that was filed against him by Chevron. Both of these trends were really evident in the two lawsuits that were filed against Greenpeace International and Greenpeace USA in 2016 and 2017. I joined Greenpeace International in 2015. At that point, we were already aware of this growth in SLAPPs. We had lawsuits pending against Greenpeace entities in India, in Turkey, in France, and in Canada. But the lawsuits which were filed in 2016 and 2017 were of a very different nature. And again, it goes to that trend I was saying. First of all, they used RICO, the same law that was used against Donziger. And they used this law to treat advocacy as being criminal in nature. So efforts to communicate with customers of corporations were treated as extortive, for example. And they used this law to claim ridiculous sums of money. $300,000 in the first case, $900,000 in the second case. And so we recognized that this was a threat not just to Greenpeace, but to civil society more broadly. And as a result, in early 2018, about 24 civil society groups convened in the office of Greenpeace USA to discuss how to build collective resilience to SLAPPs. And the anti-SLAPP strategy that came out of that meeting had a number of components to it. But there are two things I'd emphasize in particular, two assumptions that was underpinning this strategy. The first was a recognition that legal strategy will never be enough on its own to defeat SLAPPs. SLAPPs aren't concerned with the outcome of a lawsuit. They're concerned with the litigation process, which they aim to make as painful as possible for the defendant. It's important, therefore, that a SLAPP doesn't just misfire in court, but it actively backfires. And to make a lawsuit backfire, you have to create a public backlash. And in order to create a public backlash, you have to raise awareness of SLAPPs. You have to delegitimize their use in the court of public opinion. The second recognition was that any one group cannot do this. Any one individual cannot do that, particularly if you're a defendant to a lawsuit. And that's why coalition building was always at the core of this anti-SLAPP strategy. And in September of 2018, Protect the Protest, an anti-SLAPP coalition was established in the US. Over the next year, independently of these efforts, an anti-SLAPP coalition was set up in South Africa called Asina Loiko. And earlier this year, the coalition against SLAPPs in Europe was formally launched. And of course, there have been, and I know Flutura will talk more about that, so I won't go into detail in it. And of course, there have now been efforts on a national level also to bring groups together in Germany and Italy, and of course, here in the United Kingdom, which we will, of course, hear about later on. I will shut up. I realize I've been talking a bit too long, but I'll just say a bit about the model that these coalitions have in common. They all aim to build legal resilience. They aim to provide support to those who have been isolated and attacked by SLAPPs. They also aim to raise awareness of SLAPPs, to toxify their use, and they aim to advance anti-SLAPP solutions. CASE in Europe has been working on an anti-SLAPP directive. I think Flutura will talk more about that. And you'll see if you join us tomorrow afternoon that we in the UK are working on similar measures here. So I will end on that note. I will just say in short that civil society is fighting back. And there are reasons, therefore, to be optimistic, but there is a long way to go on this, and I'm really looking forward over the next 2 days to exploring this all with you. So thank you very much.
Right, Flutura, I'm delighted you're here because you can bring a European perspective to the debate, because perhaps people in London are so appalled by what, you know, not all our lawyers are like Baroness Kennedy. Let's put it like that. We have an utterly, I was going to say amoral group of lawyers in London who will work for anyone and will bring actions, libel tourism to London and sometimes to Dublin and Belfast as well. So we become rather obsessed with the UK, but you, I think, can provide a wider and more European perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also a responsibility, because I'll share with you briefly the work that we've been doing so far since 2017 in combating SLAPPs in Europe. There is a movement in Europe combating SLAPPs. It's a big movement. It all started in 2017 when Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated. As information about her was emerging, we knew that she was going under a lot of pressure, including legal pressure. She had around 50 defamation lawsuits active. What we didn't know was what it meant for her and what it meant for other journalists to be sued. And we didn't know to what extent this was a problem for other journalists. What happened afterwards, we had a group of members of the European Parliament who addressed formally to the European Commission, asking the European Commission to act. Meantime, several colleagues of mine, together we started to discuss with each other. It was CPJ, Article 19, Index, ECPMF, Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. We were having phone calls and discussing with each other whether there is anything that can be done. And this formal request, which was put forward by former members of the European Parliament, gave us hope, because first, not all of us were experts on private international law, and also we weren't sure what can be done. So the fact that they addressed to the European Commission, we thought, okay, there are things that might be done in order to address SLAPPs. We commissioned Aberdeen University. They have an excellent private international law department, and asked them whether it is possible, whether the EU has competence to address SLAPPs. After the legal analysis was drafted, we organized a small event in Brussels. This was in November 2019. The idea was to present this paper to a small group of 20 people in Brussels, mainly experts. But this turned out to be a bigger event, because around 100 people registered, and they were there, and we understood and we realized that there was a big momentum, that people were interested, and also there was appetite, especially coming from MEPs, their staff, to see whether anything could be done to address SLAPPs. After that, we continued discussions, but it was a bit difficult for all of us to organize ourselves, mainly because of lack of resources. And this is where Charlie and Greenpeace helped a lot. They brought all of us together. We had the first event in February 2020, just before global COVID lockdown, where we started to organize ourselves. So this was an event with 100 people maybe, or less, lawyers, representatives from the European Commission, journalists. We discussed what can be done. We formed different working groups, and this is where formally the work started. We formed afterwards what I call Grande Coalition. This is an informal group of around 100 people from different organizations, journalists, lawyers, who meet regularly on bi-weekly basis, and where we discuss especially how to push European institutions to address SLAPPs. We're organized on different subgroups, working groups, and from what was initial discussions with sporadic discussions with each other in 2019, now this has become for a lot of us a full-time job, working on anti-SLAPP. So we have on this Granta coalition, we have groups on EU advocacy, groups working on Council of Europe, campaign working groups, etc. We meet, as I said, every 2 weeks, and mainly we strategize how to push European institutions to act. Now, what we realized during our work was that there was research and there were data on SLAPP lawsuit, but not to the extent that we could show to the European institutions what is really going on. So what happened afterwards? Different organizations, Article 19, Greenpeace, Index on Censorship, Business and Human Rights Resource Centers, they all worked on different research projects to map SLAPPs and also to explain why it's happening and how we can tackle them. So now you have already different research projects on SLAPPs. At the same time, we realize that it's necessary to document regularly SLAPPs. We realize that we're not talking about SLAPP lawsuits, which happened 2 or 3 years ago, and that we have to deal with those. We realize, and you know, that SLAPPs are filed regularly, and you have cases emerging on daily basis. We have recently the tentative SLAPP lawsuit by Boris Johnson. I don't think it materialized, but maybe we'll hear more during the UK panel. Now, there are 2 very good platforms which are mapping SLAPPs. One is Mapping Media Freedom, which is run by ECPMF. We had a 1-year project which was financed by Justice for Journalists Foundation on mapping a SLAPP lawsuit, and I think this was one of the very few projects in Europe focusing solely on SLAPPs. And also the Council of Europe platform on safety of journalists maps a SLAPP lawsuit. It has not been easy for the simple reason because not all journalists like to speak about SLAPP lawsuits. Unfortunately, there is a stigma attached to being sued because you feel that your investigation, your story is being questioned. So we put a lot of efforts actually convincing journalists to speak up about SLAPPs. And then on 26th of March of this year, we launched formally the case, the Anti-SLAPP Coalition in Europe. This is a smaller group so that we can operate. It's around 35 members. We work on exposing SLAPPs and those who use them, mainly naming and shaming lawyers, because we think they're playing a very big role in all this. We build resilience, and also we advocate for law reforms. There is also an annual European SLAPP contest. I invite all of you to watch it online. It's a nice event. It's for sad stories, but I think it's a very nice way to attract attention to this phenomenon. We're also providing legal support to journalists who are being slapped. Not all journalists around Europe have the financial means and lawyers helping them. You have journalists who, as soon as they are slapped, they think of giving up and changing profession. So we're providing financial support for lawyers' fees. This is ECPMF, FPU, MLDI, and other organizations. And I will conclude with highlights of our work and also some achievements. The highlight, I think, of our work in these 3 years, apart of having 2 anti-SLAPP babies, some members of the group, including myself, we gave birth to babies during this time, so we have 2 anti-SLAPP babies. We've called on the European Commission for a model directive which should address early dismissal of SLAPP claims, rules ensuring fair award of cost penalties as deterrent, and also provisions on assistance, support, and protection for SLAPP targets. And also we've called on the Council of Europe to come up with a self-standing recommendation on anti-SLAPP. What we have achieved so far, first of all, we've pushed the European Commission to come up with an anti-SLAPP expert group. Some of us are members of this group. We're advising the European Commission on finding solutions to SLAPPs. There are not only initiatives, but we hope soon we will have something from the European Commission, whether it will be an anti-SLAPP directive or something with a narrow scope. We don't know, but we know that they're working hard to address this, and we're very thankful to Vera Jourova, who has been such a good media friend. She has supported us from the very beginning, and it's really a pleasure to work with someone that wants to address SLAPPs and understands the role of media in democratic societies. We have the European Parliament who voted the EU report, own initiative report recently, calling the European Commission to come up with legislative solutions. And finally, we have the Council of Europe, who are quite active. We might hear some very positive developments, but I can't say more to that. So to conclude on this, in a matter of 3 years, we have all European institutions addressing SLAPPs. And this is mainly thanks to Daphne Caruana Galicia and her family. I conclude here and happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you. Right, now Jessica from Index on Censorship, who, I mean, I can say as a working journalist, and I think other journalists who've got into trouble or facing a lot of pressure will say is an organisation you can always turn to and will always provide support. And provide support in a way Charlie was mentioning, by just getting it out there, by getting what's wrong, by getting the threats out there, because it shares the burden, and also it tells people who are using the legal system, well, you know, this doesn't come cost-free. You know, you could have a bit of a Streisand effect here, as more and more people start getting on and pointing at you, and you might be creating more trouble for yourself than you realise. Anyway, Jessica, off you go, and I imagine you will talk about the British context, but feel free to roam the globe.
Thanks a lot, Nick. I'll try to do that. I wanted to talk a little bit as well about the broader factors which has led to the rise in SLAPPs since it was first identified, as Charlie said, in the 1980s. Because we think about SLAPPs as an abuse of the law, but of course there's contributing factors as well that have really helped to perpetuate them further. They don't just happen in a vacuum, and I'm going to mention 3 in particular of these factors. Firstly, I think they go hand in hand with the rise in verbal and physical attacks on journalists and on the media that we've seen in recent years. And this really creates an environment in which it's acceptable to sue a journalist or to threaten, for that fact, to threaten legal action as well. And I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump, I'm a little bit surprised that it's taken this long for him to be mentioned, actually, because he's really at the forefront of this. I mean, he's bragged about suing journalists really openly, including, I believe it was the journalist Timothy O'Brien, which he said about, I spent a few bucks on legal fees. They spent a whole lot more. I did it to make his life miserable, which I'm happy about. So, you know, this is a case in point in what SLAPPs are. He did it with no intention of the lawsuit being successful. It was purely to intimidate the journalist and to deprive them of time, money and energy. Secondly, and as Nick said at the beginning, which I think is an important point and one that journalists mention a lot when we speak to them about this, is the massive economic pressure that media outlets are under, kind of caused, I suppose, by many issues, but including the kind of demise of print media in particular and the rise of social media. And this, of course, therefore as well, makes it really difficult for journalists to have access to the same level of legal support. So if they receive a legal threat, instead of turning to a lawyer and saying, what about this, if they don't have the money or resources to do that, they will just take down their article instead and just shut up about it. And so that's a really big risk. And then if the lawsuit is filed, they might be just inclined to settle instead, because they'll realise that they will rack up really, really significant costs very quickly if they decide to pursue it. And of course, I think it really needs to be said that this happens even if they're reporting, even if they believe in their reporting, and even if it's accurate and in the public interest, as we said in the video as well. So this is why it's so concerning, and it not only concerns journalists. This is not a problem just of journalists. This is a problem for all of us, because it means that we do not have access to the very information that we're entitled to. And I think it's I mean it fits into SLAPP's kind of fits into a broader problem as well of that we're hearing a lot about, which is rising inequality. So I think it was in 1987 there were I think I'm looking at my notes here 140 billionaires in the world, and today that number is closer to 3,000. So I think the number, this kind of rise in wealth among a number of people as well, is contributing to an industry which I think London is very familiar with, the rise of firms, reputation management firms and legal firms that really specialise in this. And of course this industry therefore is really intent on shrouding power and wealth in opacity and protecting wealthy and powerful individuals from scrutiny. So yeah, there's a lot that we need to do as civil society, as journalists, as as members of the public, that we need to do to really address this unequal playing field. As has been mentioned already, we really need to build solidarity and support for those who are targeted. And as Charlie said, in early 2021, Index on Censorship and Foreign Policy Centre set up the informal UK anti-SLAPP working group, and now we're very glad to be joined by English Pen as well. And a lot of the members of the working group, there's approximately 30 members, I believe, at the moment from different civil society, anti-corruption organisations, media freedom organisations, as well as academics and legal experts as well. And we have monthly meetings about SLAPPs in the UK where we discuss new cases and so on. And one of the main aims of this working group is highlighting SLAPPs, which has been said is really important. And I think using this terminology as well of SLAPP and making the public and aware of this issue and making them understand it, because we don't want it to be seen as some kind of jargon where people just tune out. We want them to really listen when this is happening, and I think that that will hopefully help our efforts in campaigning as well against SLAPPs. And I suppose thirdly as well, we need to campaign for legal and regulatory reform in this area, which I think we're going to discuss a little bit more. I know, Nick, you were keen on talking about that. But I'd like to mention as well the policy paper that the working group published earlier this year, recommending some measures in this regard, including an anti-SLAPP law. So as we've seen, as Flutura mentioned, in the EU, they've made a lot of progress in this regard. Unfortunately, even though the UK is one of the main sources of legal threats and actions against journalists, there's been unfortunately little action here so far. So where the UK should be leading so far, it's a laggard. So we need to really make sure that they take on their duty to address this. I think I'll maybe stop there.
Thank you very much, Jess. You made a very important point. You made a very important point, which goes to what Flutura was saying, because you said it's very difficult to get journalists to talk about when they've been successfully sued. But what Jessica raised, which is a far more pressing issue, I would say, it's even harder to get journalists, to get activists, to get NGOs to admit when they've self-censored. Because that really goes against the whole image of brave people speaking truth to power. And it's also what people in power, and I don't just mean corporations and oligarchs, I mean Twitter mobs, everyone wants. Self-censorship is by far the best, because censorship no one can see. You can always pretend it doesn't even exist. You don't even have to pretend to be a bully then, or a rich man, or using hundreds and hundreds of lawyers. You can just say, look, I haven't done anything. Everyone's just quiet. No one thinks it's a problem, apart from you who are speaking out, and you can isolate people that way. And I think that is the hardest thing to research, because one, how do you know who to ask if they're not saying anything? And two, people are really ashamed of self-censorship, and all kinds of defence mechanisms come in. And as I say, I see it as much as pressure from the liberal left on people, as well as and pressure from right-wing people who haven't got great wealth on their supporters to toe the line. But it's really noticeable as a working journalist in Britain how I can write what I want about Boris Johnson. As my lawyers don't mind. God help me if I write about a Russian oligarch. I can still do it, but lawyers descend like a commando unit coming down a cliff face on me, and that's the same. That's the same for everyone writing in this area, because people are frightened. Anyway, enough of that. Lady Nancy, are you there? We've got our hello there. Can you hear us? I'm not sure we can hear you, can we? I think our top tech team is about to get to work. Hello? Nancy, I'm afraid you're a bit you're muted at the moment. So is there some kind of button you can press or something? No, it doesn't seem to be working. Sorry?
It seems to be on her side.
Yeah, Nancy, our technical people are saying, are you on mute or something? No? Well, look, we'll have the hello? No, this isn't working. We'll come back to you as soon as we've established a connection. And while we wait, I'll ask some questions of the people here. Charlie,
Nick, can I just address what you said on maybe
please,
just following up on this stigma with journalists? So I mentioned very briefly that we have had difficulties, and we still face difficulties in convincing journalists to speak up about their cases. And I think there are 3 or 4 reasons mainly. One is, I'm a lawyer myself,
right.
But I don't practice in court, so I think there is a very big difference on how we see things compared to lawyers practicing in court. The first advice in many of the cases is that they shouldn't speak up, and I think this is a very bad advice, because there are ways how you can inform the public what is happening to you without endangering your case in court. But as I said, most of the time where we discuss with lawyers, they're like, no, you shouldn't say anything. So then it takes a lot of time first to convince lawyers, and then journalists to speak about their cases. Secondly, I think it's also the fact that you're dealing with a court, so every time courts are mentioned, especially in cases where there is a rule of law, because there is a difference in countries where journalists have less trust in courts. They're like, yes, we will talk about it, we don't care. In countries, I think, where there is a rule of law, there is this fear that you might have consequences in prejudicing the case and what the public will say. So again, you have this factor contributing. And also you have there is a difference between journalists who have support and those who don't have support in terms of financially, lawyers, organizations, etc. We've worked with a lot of journalists in Malta, in Bulgaria, in Poland, in Croatia, and we have convinced them to document their cases publicly, but we still face a lot of resistance. And this is just to say that in those cases, when we managed to publicize these cases, the result was usually positive, because it was possible to gather a lot of solidarity to help journalists financially, and then eventually it was clear that these were SLAPP lawsuits, and you had businessmen or politicians who, because of the pressure, they withdraw their lawsuits. So I hope, and just to use this opportunity to ask journalists to please publicize your cases. Of course, with a lot of cautious, but I think the way forward is to register and document SLAPPs.
Now that's something I think I'm right in saying, Charlie, you were talking about, that you were mentioning about building connections, building publicity as a countermeasure against legal intimidation.
Yeah. Actually, one thing I think is important is that the very nature, the very existence of a coalition can act as a deterrent. SLAPP litigants often work by trying to isolate and marginalize and discredit their victim. So they will make a distinction between reputable and disreputable media outlets. It's completely spurious, of course, but they'll do the same thing. If you have a big network if you're able to project that solidarity, then you're making it clear that civil society will not be divided. The mantra we often use is an attack on one is an attack on all, borrowing from NATO. But it is an important statement that we're making. We're signaling that you're not going to be able to have that effect. And also, you're signaling to potential SLAPP litigants that if you are to attack that, it's not just going to be that one organization or that one media outlet which is going to respond and call that lawsuit out as a SLAPP. It's going to be the entirety of civil society. That's important.
Two questions arise from that. How does that work? How does the power of publicity work when other media organizations are looking at a corporation, a Russian oligarch, hiring the most expensive lawyers they can, and essentially saying your budget is unlimited? And other media organizations will say, well, come on, Charlie, we write about this, wham, we're going to get hit by the same, but by the same legal threats. And we end up in a position, I've had this put to me several times, look, Nick, you want to write about what you think is an outrageous case going through the High Court. If you say this journalist is a good journalist and her book, her articles are fantastic, we can then be sued because you are endorsing them for a story we haven't done the research and we have no defense on. So how does that work in the kind of atmosphere of fear that I was saying to Helena Kennedy before we came on? I have been told. I think I can probably say this. There's the most extraordinary case going on in London about Catherine Belton, whose book Putin's People was sued by 4 Russian billionaires and Rosneft, which is Putin's private energy company, although very carefully now to get round US sanctions, it's not wholly state-owned, Russian state-owned. And I was told, and I was wanting to say, well, hold on a second, how on earth have the court system of a free country come to be used by people, by regimes who are actually enemies of this country? Russia is a self-declared enemy of Britain, as is China. You wait till the Chinese Communist Party finds out what London can do for them. And I was actually told, look, Nick, you cannot say this is a brilliant book, because you will be then endorsing. You cannot say that Catherine Belton is, despite stiff competition, one of the best Moscow correspondents there's ever been, because that would mean you are endorsing it. So I ended up writing a piece which I said, this is a book I can't review. This is a book, and but how do you get around that problem, Charlie?
So I'd say the first thing is that these legal threats and lawsuits are often bogus. They're totally bogus. And I think one of the reasons they succeed is what Jessica was saying, which is that so often the journalists or the media outlets will just retract their criticism because they don't have the finances to be able to sustain it.
How does your campaign to, if you like, name and shame, to publicise what is going on, how does that work?
Well, because part of it is that if you've got enough organisations who are able to call their bluff, then those tactics don't work. And also because people become more cognizant of the fact that there are these things called SLAPPs, and that this is then a SLAPP. And so you're able to say that this isn't a legitimate lawsuit. And so SLAPP litigants are not able to masquerade as genuine litigants. So I think that's an important part. But I mean, so often you'll see that SLAPPs are, as I was saying earlier, preceded by a long years of general legal intimidation. What they'll do is they'll go to one news outlet and they will issue a heavy-handed legal threat. That media outlet will apologize and retract, and then they will use that retraction to further justify further legal threats.
Or even pretend they've had a retraction when they haven't. I'm naming no names here, Amazon. But you know, I remember reviewing a very good book about working in Amazon warehouses, and Amazon's PR department came on and said, well, Times said this about you, and they had to print a retraction, and Times never printed a retraction, but they just use it to slip. I'm very, very conscious, incidentally, we still haven't heard from Nancy. How's that going? Hello? Lady Nancy, can you try talking a bit more? No, I'm so sorry. You're still not coming through. Nancy, I'll ask a few more questions, but as soon as we can talk to you, I'm sure the organisers will start waving at me and saying we've got a connection.
I was just, in the meantime, I wanted to come in on that point by mentioning, on the point we were talking about previously in terms of raising cases, by mentioning a recent case, and maybe some of you will have seen from just last week, to do with the New European. And I think the New European is a good case in point of how it can backfire really quickly. So for those of you who maybe are less familiar, the New European had written a piece about Boris Johnson. I mean, you can read the piece yourself, it's still online, luckily. But they had written a piece to do with Boris Johnson. Then Number 10 didn't like it, so they rang the editor of the New European, I believe, on Thursday night, saying that they were going to sue them, that they needed to take it down immediately. But the New European, instead of taking it down, instead of being intimidated, they doubled down and said, no, we're not removing it, and they published a piece about saying we've been threatened. So that was retweeted. It was covered in many of the news outlets as well since, and within hours, you know, the Number 10 backed down and said, okay, well, we're not going to sue, actually. So this is exactly how it works, and this is what we need to, you know, how our campaign and how working groups and how kind of building solidarity, because as you said, SLAPP lawsuits are intended to isolate journalists, so we need to ensure that it's that they do quite the opposite by speaking out about them, because after all, light is the best disinfectant with things like this. We really need to just shine a light in there and make sure that they aren't successful.
And the campaign works because if there is a journalist who has been sued, and then we issue a statement as a gesture of solidarity, offering legal support. These statements are usually signed by 30, 40 organizations. That would mean that the company or the businessman would have to sue 30, 40 organizations in different jurisdictions for defamation, which is usually never the case. So I think the fact that we are a very large group in different countries, it helps them, and that it will be very difficult for them to intimidate us.
Right, now, we've actually had a question from, sorry, my site's on this, Anek van Wodenberg about what the British government should do. And I do want to turn to this because there is a problem when talking about this issue. Well, there are two. The first is, why should we care about journalists? To which, to me, the answer is that really, ever since the web began, and increasingly with social media, everyone is potentially a journalist. But you know, if you publish, if you investigate, you don't have to be part of a formal media organisation to do that. But the second part is far harder. And I think it's one that if you're going to get legal change, that everyone needs to answer is, the woman or man in the street might say, well, look, Jessica, Nick, you're going on about this case these very wealthy people are bringing, but surely if the media organisation has done nothing wrong, they can just go to court and defend themselves and win. To which the answer, particularly for everyone working in Britain, but as Ireland as well, which is becoming very important, and Belfast too, will be yes, but that's not the aim. It's a SLAPP action. The aim is to just tie people down for years and hit them with costs. How then your person quizzing you might say, how are you going to stop this? What legally are you going to do? I mean, you keep talking about what the European Commission is working on, and what practically would an anti-SLAPP measure look like if it came about? What would you like to see? How would it work?
The main thing that we hope to see is the European Commission to oblige member states for the early dismissal of SLAPPs. This is the main aspect that we're looking at, which is not the only measure. There are also other legislative and non-legislative measures, such as providing legal support, legal aid to journalists, and other safeguards. But, and this is also my personal take, Charlie can also help, early dismissal is the solution. That would mean that as soon as a case is filed before the court dismisses SLAPP lawsuits, so the journalists don't waste time, money, and energy. This is the solution. We'll have to see whether this will happen.
How are you going to define the SLAPP action? Because there is a danger that, if you're liberal left, you think billionaires, corporations evil, therefore anything they do must be a SLAPP action. Whereas someone on the right might say a left-wing politician suing the Daily Mail, say here in Britain, which is a right-wing newspaper, that's a SLAPP action. How are you going to define them, and how do you want courts to say, yes, that is an illicit action, and we're going to stop it in its tracks right now, and no, this is a fair enough point, it can go ahead?
The whole discussion now within the anti-SLAPP expert group is about how to define SLAPPs. And I'll ask Charlie to help me, because he's on the SLAPP legal group working on this.
Well, I'd say one thing about it is you don't necessarily need to. What you're doing is you can just say, this is an action which is targeting an act of public participation. Public participation, should be defined broadly, and there are means, and there have been numerous inquiries in the US about what a robust anti-SLAPP law looks like. There are numerous ways to safeguard to ensure the definition of public interest doesn't stretch so far, but courts are used to dealing with this concept of public interest, and it's already defined in different contexts, such as defamation law. What I would say, though, is once you've identified that a claim is targeting an act of public participation, you don't require the judge to say this is a SLAPP. You just have a mechanism in place that requires the plaintiff then to show at the earliest point in proceedings that it meets a certain merits test. It shows that for example, it has a likely or probable chance of success. And that then provides that filter mechanism without having to get bogged down in definitions.
Do you think British and European law, if you're serious about this, you're heading to where American law headed in 1964 with libel, with Sullivan v. The New York Times, which essentially said to protect the civil rights movement in Alabama, which was every time New York Times and liberal American papers reported on what was happening, the oppression of the civil rights movement, they were just being sued. It would have bankrupted the liberal press in America, and what the Supreme Court says in 1964 is, if you're a public official, if you're a police chief, it then becomes a public figure. Essentially, you can't really sue for libel.
Yeah.
Is that where we're heading? Are we saying, look, if you are, I don't know, Shell, and people are saying about you polluting off the Nigerian coast, or if you're Roman Abramovich and you're worth billions and billions, well, frankly, you've just got to suck it up. Or you have the power to put out your own side, to say why these people criticizing you are wrong. You can't drag the law into it. Is that where we're going, or is that too liberal for you?
No, I would love to see a Sullivan test in the UK, but it is a slightly different matter, because then you're saying that public officials have to meet that higher threshold. And certainly I think when we're talking about where defamation reform still needs to go, that is a direction I think it should go in. But it is a different matter, and it goes back to what we're saying. Well, because it's a difference between the outcome and the process, as we were talking about earlier, right? So you're talking about regardless of the law that's being used, regardless of the litigant, with an anti-SLAPP protections, you'll want to filter that out at the earliest possible stage, and that requires a sort of broader merits test.
Well, I was going to go on to Jessica about this, but after what must be the biggest build-up this conference has had for any single speaker, we finally have Nancy.
Hopefully, can you hear me?
Hooray! Okay.
Okay,
Thank you
well,
so much, and thank you so much for your patience as we fiddle with all technology. Nancy is legal researcher at Business and Human Rights, and also the author of SLAPP but Not Silent. So please go ahead. The floor is finally yours.
thank you very much, Nick, and thank you very much to all the co-panelists. I have missed part of the discussions trying to solve this issue, but I'm happy to finally be here. So, as Nick mentioned, I work for the Human Rights Resource Center, and the Resource Center has done some work on SLAPP since a couple of years ago. And maybe one important thing to mention is that we start conducting this research on SLAPPs because we identify that SLAPPs were one of type of attack commonly used by business actors to silence and intimidate defenders. So in 2019, based on these findings on our broad research on attacks against human rights defenders, and also having several conversations with organizations in the field, with Greenpeace and others, we just start conducting a deep research on the use of SLAPPs to better understand the nature and scale. So we have released different reports and briefings on the use of SLAPPs, but maybe I will just focus on the one we released in June this year, as Nick mentioned. And in this report, we just identify more than 355 SLAPPs globally. And our scope is a little bit narrow because of the nature of our organization that is focused on business and human rights. So we covered lawsuits, criminal or civil lawsuits against human rights defenders raising concerns about business activities. We also, in this research, we include cases against journalists, and in our research, at least from 2015 to May this year, we have identified at least 44 cases brought against journalists. And this is something very important to mention, but we see that this number is increasing in some jurisdictions. Many of those cases were brought in Guatemala, in Thailand, in Malta, France, Albania, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but also in other jurisdictions in Asia. So with this research, we realized that SLAPP is a global phenomenon and are just attacking people from all over the world. And also something important to mention is that journalists are facing those lawsuits by diverse sectors. In our research, we identify that mining is one of the sectors more using SLAPPs against journalists, but also the finance and banking sector, but also the energy sector. And this is also something important to have in mind when we're thinking in terms of what we can do to fight SLAPPs. So it's important to have anti-SLAPP legislation, for instance, but also it's important to raise awareness amongst investors or other stakeholders to fight this type of attack against journalists and defenders more broadly. And finally, something important to mention is that in our research, since we cover civil and criminal lawsuits, at least 20 of them, the cases we identify against journalists were based on criminal complaints. And this is very scary if we think in terms of the consequences that a criminal lawsuit can have. For instance, long prison sentences or even a death sentence, as we found in a case in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So when we think about measures to fight SLAPPs, we also need to make some reforms in terms of the defamations or libel laws, because these are the ones that are more commonly used by business actors to silence journalists. So I will just stop here, and I think I missed part of the conversation, but I'm looking now forward to engage in the discussion. Thank you.
Nancy, sorry. Can I ask, when you talk about lawsuits in Democratic Republic of Congo, how can what Britain, the EU, and possibly the US does, can that help people in more autocratic parts of the world?
Well,
can reforms here have global benefits, in other words?
I think yes, of course, because now in some regions we are also seeing how organizations and coalitions are learning each other from the actions they are taking in a specific region. So now, for example, in Colombia, there is one initiative to reform our civil code to have anti-SLAPP provisions, and this is based on what we have learned in other jurisdictions or in other regions. So it's so important to continue working in local coalitions, but also trying to engage in maybe we can say in a global coalition that can maybe promote some initiatives in specific regions. But also something important to have in mind is that each jurisdiction is different, each country is different. So when we think about measures to implement in specific countries, we also need to think about what are the specificities in that jurisdiction and in that legal framework, because as I mentioned in our research, we include criminal cases, but we know that in other jurisdictions in Europe or in North America, for instance, their cases are based on civil complaints. So when we need to think more about what we can do in terms of fight SLAPPs in different levels.
Yes, if I could bring in some of the people who are very kindly writing in. There's a point made by Simon Taylor. This takes your point from the global to the local about London, and he says, well, all these London law firms, how can people keep threatening to sue in London? Almost a decade ago now, there was a very successful attempt which Penn and Index on Censorship were involved in to reform the English libel law, and we thought we'd stop libel tourism, but it's still going on. He wants to know how can so many people from around the world come to London to sue, and what can? And this is Simon Taylor asking this question: what can be done about it? And Nick Williams is sort of making the same point. He says, and I don't know this is true, but he says in Australia there's a defamation model where any company with more than 10 employees can't sue. Which actually does raise an interesting question about. Sorry?
I can vouch for that. That is true.
What a fantastic country. Yes. We could all move there.
Defamation laws are appalling, but that's quite a good part.
Yeah, you've broken free from the pommy legal inheritance in one respect. Well, that's brilliant. But that does raise an interesting question about companies being legal persons and being able to sue. But again, it comes back to what we were talking about before of. What should we do? We've had talk about how an anti-SLAPP action would work in Europe. Now, you and Charlie are thinking more about Britain. How do you see it working here? Or do you see, like Australia, say, look, unless you're a small business, you can't bloody sue. Not for libel, not for data protection, the works. Just get on with it. Book sharp. How do you think this should be done?
Well, I think it's a discussion that we've been having. We've been having legal roundtables as well, led by Charlie as part of the UK working group, looking at how we can do this. Because of course, and I know that there's specifically a panel on this later on today or tomorrow on why the UK is such an attractive jurisdiction. But of course, as well, I think it's just worth mentioning in this regard, and maybe it doesn't specifically address your question, Nick, but I think it's worth mentioning that as a symptom of SLAPP, very often we see that SLAPPs are cross-border. And you mentioned the Catherine Belton case, and she's being sued in the UK, of course, by Abramovich, but he's also taking legal action against her in Australia. So this is something as well that we see as a symptom that they sometimes slappers, these litigants will sue in several jurisdictions.
Right.
So it is something that we need to consider in an anti-SLAPP action. Why this is happening. Also, Helena Kennedy, Baroness Kennedy mentioned the research that Foreign Policy published last year about the fact that the UK is a larger source of legal intimidation to EU journalists, I think, or journalists globally, than the EU and the US combined. So I think the cross-border symptom, if you will, of SLAPPs is something that we will need to look at, and hopefully an anti-SLAPP law would take that into consideration. Maybe Charlie, I don't know if you want to come in and speak a little bit more about that too.
Well, I mean, as you quite rightly said, Nick, the Defamation Act of 2013 did institute some measures to guard against libel tourism. It's continued. I think we're still in the process of exploring whether or not new jurisdictional hurdles need to be introduced in that case. But I do think there's a broader point, which is that why is it that this jurisdiction is so attractive to SLAPP litigants? Because it undoubtedly is.
It's just the power of money. It's the cost.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember there's a. Oh God, you have to be so careful what you have to say. There's a Swedish business newspaper. Guess knows all about this. There's a Swedish business newspaper, not the biggest market in the world, reporting on the dealings of the Norwegian Stock Exchange. Again, not the greatest of global bourses, which is now being sued by a Monaco billionaire in London for its report on trading in shares in an energy company. And it's very hard, I think, to say to British judges who've been brought up in, as in Australia, in the common law, to just say, you don't seem to understand. Your whole system is the problem. It's not that we don't doubt you can reach an honest verdict at the end, 3 or 4 years down the line, after the attempt's gone to the Court of Appeal and probably the Supreme Court. It's not that we don't doubt that you are honest and competent and diligent judges. It's the system you have spent your life in is terrifying, and it is massively biased towards wealth. And I think that's very hard for English judges and lawyers to accept. On the whole, judges are, in my experience, wholly honourable, diligent people. It's very hard for them to accept, saying that you don't seem to understand what is killing freedom in this country, and the reason you are so popular. People are, is not because you're corrupt. Precisely, verdicts from English courts are accepted because no one believes that English judges are corrupt. It's because your system is so massively unbalanced. Yeah. And I think, and as there are so many lawyers in politics and the House of Lords, it is very hard to get that point over. I'm conscious of time, and I want to bring some more people in. He's going to have to forgive me if I mispronounce his name, but Yarman Akdeniz makes a point which I think is very important, which I've tried to make on the start, because inevitably we talk about journalists because the media as well as the point, but he says, this isn't just about journalists, it's about NGOs, it's about human rights activists, it's about academics, it's about just anyone really. The great point of the revolution, of the web revolution, is potentially everyone's a journalist. And I do think in terms of campaigning, perhaps Charlie, you'd like to talk about this, on the need to make that clear to the public that we're not asking for special privileges for journalists who are not on the whole the most loved members of society. Yeah,
that's a really important point. We do try to emphasize in all of our campaigns and communications, and the index video, which you give the voice for, makes the point really well, that SLAPPs target public watchdogs. It targets those whose function it is in a society to hold the powerful to account. And as you quite correctly say, that can encompass everything from academics to journalists to activists to bloggers. Yeah. And I think that's the important. It's not the the formal role. It's not whether you have a press credentials. It's whether or not you're fulfilling that function in society. So that's, I think, the point that we're trying to make.
Also, just to add, there were discussions 2 years ago with people within Council of Europe and the EU whether legislative and non-legislative measures should only focus on journalists or whether including also other activists, etc. And now we can say that hopefully the scope will be broader.
Yes.
Initially there was appetite only to support journalists for different reasons, but from what we see now within the European Commission and also Council of Europe, it will not only tackle the work of journalists but also other human rights defenders, academics, etc.
Yeah,
so there's hope also for
I mean, this is the best of the Anglo-Saxon journalistic tradition. Is journalists used to say, we are not a profession. We are not a caste. We're just citizens with typewriters. And I think that that has become ever more important with the explosion that the web has brought, and that we are not asking for special rights for a caste and elite, however you want to define it. That these are rights for everyone, because in theory you're involved in any campaign at all. In theory, if you touch an interest that's either rich enough or sometimes just obsessive enough, sometimes you're not dealing with these cases, not about wealthy people, they're about complete obsessives, what English lawyers used to call vexatious litigants. As Charlie and you and Nancy said, you can ruin people's lives. You can just consume them for years on end. And I think it's very important to say that these measures are available to all citizens. That any protections you get. Jess and Charlie, Jess, how are we doing for time? We haven't got any. How are we doing for time? We are, in fact, completely out of time.
I'm going to be really curious what it was.
I was just going to say very, very quickly, are we getting anywhere with the British government by this, or is essentially a government run by Boris Johnson, funded by the super rich, highly unlikely to do anything at all to change the status quo that suits it very well? Yes.
Well, we're having meetings with the Ministry of Justice, and we really hope that they will take it forward in the coming weeks and months. But and we hope as well that the UK, of course, will act. I mean, Flutura, you mentioned the Council of Europe, and the UK has left the EU, but of course they're still in the Council of Europe, and we'd really like to see the UK as well taking a leading role there, given the fact that they are, as we said, the cross-border dimension, that this is an issue as well that extends outside the UK. So hopefully we'll see more action there too from the UK government.
Hopeful words indeed there from Jess. Charlie, are you prepared to be so optimistic?
I was going to keep it really simple and just say, yes, I am very optimistic, and you should join us tomorrow afternoon to hear more about this and the proposed UK measures.
Okay. If either of your optimism fails and turns out to be wholly Panglossian misguided, let me know and I'll write a piece about it. Which only remains me to say thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for the audience here and for people watching at home. And we are we having a lunch break? Just a tea break. Lunch comes later. Thanks so much. And could you please join me in thanking our panel? Thank you.